3 military officers laughed at her. They mocked her old uniform, the faded patch, the audacity of a 54-year-old woman stepping onto their turf. What they didn't know was that in less than 5 minutes, they'd find out they had just humiliated one of the greatest military heroines they would ever meet. And when the truth came out, the silence was deafening. 2 hours earlier, under the suffocating heat of a summer morning in the southern United States, Margaret Johnson pulled her simple car into the entrance of Fort Benning military base. 54 years old, short hair braided with a few strands of gray, she carried only a small backpack and a civilian ID card. Margaret wasn't there to enlist or visit family. She had been invited as a civilian volunteer to support a simulation exercise, a rescue mission in a conflict zone that would test the skills of new recruits. Her previous experience had been cleared by the higher-ups, but the details, well, those details were locked away in files few people ever saw. All she needed were some basic supplies, a tactical vest and a hydration kit. Nothing more. A simple task that led her to the base's logistics depot, where her true story was about to be revealed in the most unexpected way. The depot was run by 3 freshly minted lieutenants. Ryan Mitchell, 22, his uniform spotless like he'd stepped out of a military magazine. Beside him were Jake Thompson and Marcus Brown, both carrying that same arrogance of men who had never set foot on a real battlefield, but felt entitled to judge anyone who crossed their path. When Margaret walked in, wearing her old military jacket, worn by time, faded by the sun of deserts they couldn't even imagine, the 3 shared a knowing look. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Ryan asked, dragging out the word ma'am with a tone dripping in disrespect. "I'm here to pick up a tactical vest and hydration kit. I'm volunteering for today's exercise." Jake let out a quiet laugh. "Volunteer? Are you sure you're in the right place, ma'am? The church bingo's on the other side of town." Marcus pointed at the patch on her jacket, so faded it looked like a stain on the fabric. "And that relic? You buy it at a costume shop?" The 3 of them laughed, a laugh that echoed through the depot like a slap across the dignity of a woman who had risked her life for people who didn't even know she existed. Margaret didn't respond. She just stood there, her gaze steady. The same gaze that had faced situations 1,000 times more dangerous than the humiliation from 3 boys in uniform. But someone was watching. Across the hallway, standing in the shadow of a column, was General Robert Harrison, Special Operations veteran, 40 years of military service, scars telling stories that never made it to Hollywood, and he had witnessed the entire scene. He walked over slowly, his steps echoing in the silence that fell when the 3 lieutenants noticed a superior officer in their midst. "Soldiers!" His voice cut through the air like a blade. They snapped to attention instantly, but General Harrison didn't look at them. His eyes were fixed on the nearly invisible patch on Margaret's jacket. He stepped closer, studying every detail of that piece of fabric that seemed meaningless. "Ma'am," he said, with a respect that clashed brutally with the treatment she'd received seconds earlier. "May I ask about that insignia?" Margaret looked him in the eye. She immediately recognized not just authority, but something else. The recognition of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. "Rapid Response Force 7, sir. Operation Silent Storm, Operation Ghost Rescue." The silence that followed was unlike anything those 3 lieutenants had ever experienced. It wasn't just silence. It was the weight of history unfolding before them. General Harrison closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was something in his expression that the 3 young officers had never seen before: reverence. "Operation Ghost Rescue," he whispered, as if he were speaking the name of something sacred. The 3 lieutenants exchanged confused looks. They'd never heard of these operations. But by the change in the atmosphere, by the way the general was looking at the woman they had just humiliated, something was about to be revealed. Something that would forever change the way they remembered that summer morning. If this story is already moving you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what comes next is even more powerful. You're about to find out what really happened during Operation Ghost Rescue, and why this woman never needed to prove anything to anyone. General Harrison took a deep breath. His eyes never left Margaret's face, as if he were seeing a ghost from the past come back to life. 63 soldiers, he murmured, his voice heavy with an emotion he rarely let show. Trapped by insurgents in an ambush in northern Iraq. No comms, no air support, no hope. Margaret stood still, but something in her eyes shifted. The memory of that day was coming back, and with it, all the pain she had tried to bury for years. The general continued, now looking directly at the three lieutenants who were watching without fully grasping what was unfolding before them. It was 2003, a routine operation that turned into a nightmare within minutes. Our boys were pinned down in a mountainous region, running out of ammo. Insurgents closing in from every direction. Command had officially declared it an acceptable loss. And do you know what that means? Ryan, Jake, and Marcus shook their heads, their faces now pale. It means their own commanders had written them off. 63 American soldiers, some younger than you three, left to die on a mountain halfway across the world. The silence in the depot was so thick, you could hear everyone's breathing. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back the images flooding her mind like an avalanche. But there were 7 people who refused to accept that decision. 7 people who decided no American soldier would be left behind, no matter what the operations manual said. The general turned fully to Margaret. Rapid Response Force 7 didn't officially exist. It wasn't on any org chart, didn't take orders from the Pentagon, had no authorization to operate. It was made up of volunteers, former elite soldiers, experts in impossible missions, people who had sworn they'd never abandon a brother or sister. Margaret opened her eyes. For the first time since entering the depot, her voice rang out strong and clear. "We didn't have a choice. Those were our brothers up there." "Our brothers," the general echoed. "And you went to get every single one of them." The story began to play out like a movie in everyone's mind. Margaret and her 6 teammates had infiltrated the area in the dead of night, using gear they'd acquired themselves, following routes they had mapped out on their own, risking their lives on a mission that officially didn't exist. 18 hours of non-stop operation, the general continued. 18 hours under crossfire, grenades, snipers. 18 hours carrying wounded soldiers across hostile terrain. Jake swallowed hard. "And did you make it?" Margaret looked at him. It was the first time one of the 3 lieutenants had spoken to her with anything close to respect. 61 came home, she answered simply. The weight of those words settled over the room like a gravestone. "We couldn't save 2, Margaret went on, her voice quieter now. "David Chen, 19, from San Francisco. Michael Rodriguez, 22, from Texas. We reached them, but—" She paused, took a deep breath. "Sometimes you do everything right, and it's still not enough." General Harrison nodded solemnly. "What Margaret isn't telling you is that she personally carried 17 wounded soldiers to the extraction point. 17, some on her back, others in her arms. She made that dangerous trek 17 times. Marcus, who had mocked the faded patch earlier, was now staring at her with a completely different expression. "And when they came back?" Ryan asked, all his earlier arrogance gone. "When they came back," the general said with a bitter smile, "they were given an official reprimand for an unauthorized operation. Their names were scrubbed from all records. The mission was classified as ultra-secret. No one could ever know it happened. But the 61 who came home knew," Margaret said, "and their families knew. When you save someone's life, it creates a bond that goes beyond medals or official recognition." The general stepped closer, his voice now almost a whisper. "Margaret, you don't need to be here today. After everything you've done, after all those years of forced silence, you don't owe anyone anything." She looked at him, then at the 3 lieutenants who had humiliated her just minutes earlier. "It's not about what I owe," she replied. "It's about what I choose to do." And in that moment, something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would show these young officers that true heroism doesn't wear a brand new uniform or seek recognition. Because Margaret Johnson was there for a very specific reason. A reason not even the general fully understood. General Harrison studied Margaret's face for a long moment. There was something in her eyes he couldn't quite decipher. A determination that went far beyond just volunteering for a military exercise. "Margaret," he said slowly, "can I ask what really brought you here today? After all these years away from service, after everything you've been through?" She took a deep breath. It was the question she had hoped to avoid, but knew would eventually come. "One of the boys who was on that mountain," she began, her voice heavy with carefully controlled emotion. "Timothy Harrison. He was 20 at the time. The general stopped breathing. His eyes widened in instant shock and recognition. "My son," he whispered. "Your son," Margaret confirmed. "And he's participating in today's exercise." The silence that followed was unlike any before. It wasn't just surprise or reverence. It was the realization of a debt that could never truly be repaid. The three lieutenants watched the conversation without fully understanding the magnitude of what was unfolding before them, but they could feel that something deeply personal was being revealed. "Timothy never knew," the general said, more to himself than to the others. "He always told me an angel appeared on that mountain. A woman who carried him for miles through enemy fire, whispering words of encouragement when he thought he was going to die." Margaret smiled for the first time since entering the depot. "He was one of the most badly wounded. Shrapnel in his right leg, severe blood loss. But he kept trying to help the other soldiers, even when he could barely stay conscious. That's my son," the general said, his voice a mixture of pride and pain. "When I carried him for the last time to the extraction point," Margaret continued, "he grabbed my arm and said, 'Promise me you'll find my family. Promise me you'll tell my dad I tried to be brave.'" General Harrison closed his eyes, the tears he had held back for decades finally threatening to fall. "I promised," Margaret said simply, "and it took me 22 years to keep that promise." Ryan, who had mocked her just minutes before, now looked like a lost boy trying to understand the weight of his own ignorance. "You came here because of him," Jake said. "It wasn't a question, it was a realization." "Timothy became an officer," Margaret explained. "Followed in his father's footsteps, and when I found out he'd be leading today's exercise, I knew it was my chance to finally keep that promise." The general opened his eyes. "He doesn't know who you are." "No. To him, I'm just another civilian volunteer. And maybe that's for the best." "Why?" Marcus asked, genuinely confused. Margaret looked at the young lieutenant with a patience he didn't deserve. "Because some things are more powerful when they stay simple. I don't need him to know I saved his life. I just need to see him alive, thriving, leading other soldiers with the same courage he showed on that mountain." General Harrison stepped closer to her. "Margaret, you've already done more than anyone could ever ask. You saved my son. You saved 61 soldiers. You carried the weight of silence for over 2 decades. And I'd do it all again," she replied without hesitation. "But why now?" he pressed. "Why, after all these years, did you decide to come back?" Margaret looked out the depot window, where she could see soldiers preparing for the exercise. Somewhere out there, Timothy Harrison was leading his unit, unaware that the woman who saved his life was just a few feet away. "Because yesterday I turned 55, she said. "The same age my mother was when she died. And I realized there was still a promise I hadn't fulfilled." She turned back to the group. "I promised a 20-year-old kid I'd tell his dad he was brave. And even though 22 years have passed, even though that kid is now a man leading his own unit, a promise is a promise." The general reached out his hand to her. It wasn't a formal military greeting. It was the gesture of a father touching the person who brought his son home. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you for bringing my boy back to me." Margaret shook his hand. "He never needed to come home, General. He never left. The courage he showed on that mountain, that courage has always been right here." She touched her own chest. "And here," she pointed to where Timothy was training. But there was something else. Something not even the general knew about that day's exercise. Something that would turn this casual encounter into something far more meaningful. Because Timothy Harrison was about to face a situation that would test not just his military skills, but his ability to lead under extreme pressure. And Margaret Johnson wasn't there just to fulfill an old promise. She was there because somehow she knew her son from war would need her once again. General Harrison's radio crackled with an urgency that instantly changed the atmosphere in the depot. "General, we have a situation in Sector 7. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's unit is trapped in a simulation that's gone off the rails. Comms equipment malfunctioning, 2 soldiers with real injuries from falling debris, and the rescue team is 40 minutes out." Margaret felt her blood turn cold. 22 years later, Timothy was in danger again. The general grabbed the radio. "What's their exact status?" "Sir, the simulation was a hostile environment rescue scenario in a 3-story training structure. Part of the building collapsed. Wasn't supposed to happen. Lieutenant Colonel and his team are trapped on the 2nd floor with 2 injured who need immediate medical evacuation." Margaret stepped forward. "Can I see the site?" "Margaret, you don't need to get involved," the general said. But he could already tell from the look in her eyes it would be useless to try and stop her. "General," she said with the same determination that had saved 61 soldiers, "my gear is still cleared. My experience is exactly what you need, and that's my boy up there." Ryan, Jake, and Marcus exchanged glances. In just minutes, they had watched this woman go from the target of their jokes to the most qualified person on base to handle a real emergency. "I'm going with her," the general declared. "No," Margaret said firmly. "You have command responsibilities here. And besides," she gave a slight smile, "rescue is grunt work, not general's work." The general hesitated. He knew she was right, but the idea of leaving his son's fate in anyone else's hands. "Trust me," Margaret said, placing a hand on his arm. "I brought your son home once. I'll do it again." 5 minutes later, Margaret was geared up with a tactical vest, emergency medical kit, and comms equipment. The 3 lieutenants, now completely changed by what they had witnessed, insisted on helping her prepare. "Ms. Johnson," Ryan said, his voice full of respect and regret, We want to apologize." Margaret paused, adjusting her vest, and looked at the 3 young men. "You want to apologize? Then learn. Learn that heroism doesn't have an age, gender, or look. Learn that real experience leaves scars you won't see on a brand new uniform. And learn that sometimes the most important person in the room is the one no one notices." She finished gearing up and headed for the door. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got an officer to go get." The walk to the training structure took 8 minutes. The whole way, Margaret felt the years falling away. It was 2003 again. It was that mountain in Iraq again. It was the moment when every second mattered, and every decision could mean life or death. When she arrived on site, the situation was worse than she had imagined. The 3-story structure used to simulate urban operations had an entire section of the first floor collapsed. Rubble blocked the main stairwell, and smoke from a small electrical fire made it hard to see. "Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, this is Control," she said into the radio. "I'm outside the structure. What's your status?" The voice that replied was more mature, more authoritative than the 20-year-old kid she had carried down that mountain. But Margaret could still hear echoes of that scared young soldier. "Control, this is Harrison. We've got 2 injured needing immediate evac. Private Martinez with a possible compound fracture in his right leg. Private Chen with mild head trauma but conscious. Main stairwell blocked. Emergency stairs damaged. We're effectively trapped on the 2nd floor. Chen." The name hit her like a punch to the gut. Could he be related to David Chen, the young soldier she hadn't been able to save on that mountain? "Harrison, this is..." She stopped. She couldn't reveal who she was over the radio. "This is Johnson, rescue specialist. I'm coming up to you." "Negative, Johnson. Structure's unstable. Wait for official support." Margaret smiled. Even in danger, Timothy was still trying to protect others. "Harrison," she said, using the same tone she had used with wounded soldiers 2 decades ago. "Trust me. I know what I'm doing." And then she started to climb. Not up the blocked or damaged stairs, but up the outer wall, using climbing techniques she had learned on missions that officially never happened. With every foot she climbed, Margaret felt the years in her muscles, but also the strength that came from knowing she was doing exactly what she was meant to do. When she reached the 2nd-floor window, she saw Timothy for the first time in 22 years, taller, stronger, with scars of his own telling his stories, but with the same determined eyes she had seen on that mountain. He looked at her through the window with surprise, and something else, a recognition he couldn't quite place. "How the hell did you get up here?" he asked. Margaret smiled as she carefully broke the glass. "The same way I climbed a mountain in Iraq to get a stubborn kid who refused to give up on his brothers." Timothy froze. Something in that phrase, in that voice, stirred memories he had buried deep. And then, as Margaret stepped through the window and approached the wounded soldiers, he saw something that made his heart stop. Private Chen, grandson of David Chen, the same David she hadn't been able to save 22 years ago, was wearing dog tags that glinted in the light coming through the window. Everything was connected. Past and present, loss and redemption, were about to collide in a way none of them could have ever predicted. Margaret knelt beside Private Chen, her experienced hands already assessing his injuries as her eyes studied the dog tags swaying on his chest. James Chen, she read out loud, her voice filled with an emotion Timothy couldn't quite read. You know that name? Timothy asked, watching her reaction. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. I knew his grandfather. Even through the pain, James Chen looked at her curiously. My grandpa David. He died when I was a kid. In the war. He didn't just die in the war, kid, Margaret said softly, starting to stabilize his injured leg. He died a hero, trying to save other soldiers. And his grandson is here, following in the same brave footsteps. Timothy paused what he was doing. Something in her voice, in those words, was awakening a memory buried for more than 2 decades. Ma'am, he said slowly, can I ask your full name? Margaret kept working on James's injuries, but her voice softened. Margaret Johnson. But a long time ago, there was a young soldier on a mountain who used to call me an angel. The world stopped for Timothy Harrison. 22 years of suppressed memories came flooding back like a tidal wave. The voice that whispered encouragement while he was losing blood. The strong hands that carried him through enemy fire. The face he could only see in fragments through the pain and fading consciousness. You, he whispered. You're real. Margaret smiled, her tears finally breaking free. I've always been real, Timothy, and you've always been brave. She finished stabilizing James and turned to the other injured soldier, but Timothy grabbed her arm. You promised you'd find my family, he said, his voice breaking. You promised you'd tell my dad I tried to be brave. And I kept my promise, Margaret replied. I just spoke to your dad 20 minutes ago. Timothy looked at her, confused. My dad? General Robert Harrison. He was in the depot when I arrived. And when he found out who I was, Margaret smiled. He cried, Timothy. He cried tears of relief and pride knowing his son was saved by someone who never forgot him. At that moment, General Harrison's voice crackled over the radio. Margaret, rescue team arriving in 5 minutes. Status? 2 injured, stabilized, and ready for evac, she replied. And, General, your son is fine. He's exactly the brave man you raised him to be. Timothy looked at Margaret with a reverence that went beyond military respect. Why did you do it? Why did you risk your life for us on that mountain? Why come back today? Margaret helped James sit up more comfortably and looked at Timothy. Because when you put on this uniform, when you take that oath, you become family. And family doesn't leave family behind. She moved closer to the window, preparing the injured for the descent. And because 22 years ago, a 20-year-old kid taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid. Courage is doing what's right, even when you're terrified. Timothy followed her to the window. How did you know I'd need you today? Margaret smiled mysteriously. I didn't know, but a mother always knows when her children need her. The rescue team arrived just as Margaret was helping James down the rope. Timothy was the last to leave the building, but before he left, he turned to her. Margaret, he said, thank you for everything, for the mountain, for today, for never giving up. Thank you, Timothy, for reminding me why it's always worth it to never give up. 2 hours later, back in the same depot where it all started, Margaret finally removed her tactical vest and hydration kit. The 3 lieutenants, Ryan, Jake, and Marcus, were there, but now their spotless uniforms seemed insignificant compared to her presence. Ms. Johnson, Ryan said, stepping forward with genuine humility. We want you to know we learned something important today. And what was that? She asked. That real heroism doesn't need an audience, Jake replied, and that we don't know the first thing about what it means to serve. Margaret nodded. You've learned. That's what matters. General Harrison appeared in the doorway, his face still showing traces of the tears he had shed. Margaret, he said, how can I ever thank you? Don't thank me, General. Thank these 3 young officers here. They reminded me the next generation is in good hands. She turned to leave, but looked back one last time. And General, next time someone walks onto your base wearing an old uniform and a faded patch, remember that sometimes the greatest stories are written by people who never ask for recognition. Margaret Johnson walked out of the depot the same way she had entered. Simple, quiet, without fanfare. But she left behind something that would forever change that military base. The reminder that true heroes don't wear capes, don't make headlines, and don't need to prove anything to anyone. They just do what's right, when it's needed, for as long as it takes. And as she drove home that hot summer afternoon, Margaret Johnson smiled, knowing she had kept a promise she held for 22 years. Timothy was safe, James Chen was alive, and 3 young officers had learned the most important lesson of their careers. Sometimes the greatest act of heroism is simply showing up when you're needed. And you? How would you have acted in this situation? Would you have recognized this woman's worth or judged her by appearances? Tell us in the comments how this story moved you. And if you know someone who deserves recognition for sacrifices they've made in silence, tag them below. If you enjoy stories like this, share it, subscribe to the channel, and comment what touched you most. And check out the next video coming up on your screen. It really helps us, because there are thousands of Margaret Johnsons out there, and every single one of them deserves to have their story told. See you next time.